The fire marshal's inspection team arrived at the data center 40 minutes into a presentation to 11 venture capital investors, badges out, clipboards ready, walking past a lobby full of catered coffee toward a server floor that had been running 9 degrees above its rated cooling threshold for 3 weeks. I wasn't in that room when it happened. I was 2 miles away, in a new office with better lighting than the janitorial closet I'd been working out of for the past 4 months, watching my old company's stock ticker on a monitor that, as of that morning, had absolutely nothing to do with me anymore. Before I explain how a data center ends up shut down mid-pitch, hit subscribe and turn on your notifications, because you'll want to see exactly what happens when the one person legally responsible for a building's safety finally stops being willing to cover for it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been asked to put your own name on something you knew wasn't true? Welcome to Revenge Stories Narrated, where family betrayal meets inevitable justice, and karma always collects its debt. My name is Bridget. I'm 45, and for 15 years I served as operations director for a regional data center that processed transactions for roughly 40 mid-sized companies across 3 states, the kind of infrastructure nobody thinks about until it stops working. I hold a state technical license, the specific credential required by law for anyone serving as the responsible operating engineer for a facility of that size, a license that took years to earn and that I renewed, without fail, every cycle for over a decade. The facility's owner, Randall Ashgrove, built the company from a single server rack in a converted warehouse decades ago and had, for most of my tenure there, treated me as close to a partner as an employee can be treated, trusting my judgment on everything from cooling infrastructure to fire suppression contracts, without much argument. That changed about 18 months ago, when Randall began stepping back from daily operations and brought his son, Beckett, in to take over, a decision that reshaped the entire culture of that building faster than I would have thought possible. Beckett had an MBA, a habit of using the word disruption in nearly every sentence, and an immediate, dismissive certainty that the systems I'd spent 15 years building and refining were, in his words, obsolete, holding the company back from the kind of aggressive growth he intended to pitch to outside investors. 4 months ago, he moved my office out of the operations suite I'd occupied since the building's original construction and into a converted janitorial closet on the lower level, telling me plainly, in front of 2 junior staff members, that my role no longer justified the square footage and that the space was better used for a new investor lounge. The closet had no window, a single flickering overhead light I ended up replacing myself, and just enough room for a desk if I angled it against a mop sink, a detail Beckett seemed to find genuinely funny the one time he mentioned it in a meeting. I kept working. I kept the servers running, kept the fire suppression systems maintained on schedule, kept my license current, because the facility's legal ability to operate depended entirely on my continued oversight, a fact I'm not sure Beckett ever fully understood, treating my role as ceremonial rather than what it actually was, a legal requirement without which the building simply couldn't operate at all. I stopped being invited to the weekly leadership meetings around the same time my office moved, a change nobody formally announced. I simply noticed, one Tuesday, that the calendar invite I'd received every week for a decade had quietly stopped arriving. The corner cutting started small enough that I initially assumed it was oversight rather than intention. Server room cooling budgets got trimmed twice in 3 months, pushing operating temperatures steadily upward toward thresholds I flagged repeatedly in writing, emails that received brief, dismissive replies about efficiency targets rather than any real engagement with the risk. Then the fire suppression contract, held for over a decade by a licensed commercial fire safety firm, got quietly replaced with a cut-rate landscaping company Beckett had found through a personal connection, willing to sign off on inspection paperwork for a fraction of the previous contractor's rate, despite having no actual certification to service commercial fire suppression systems at all. I documented all of it, methodically, the way I approached everything in that job, time-stamped monitoring logs showing the rising server temperatures, copies of a landscaping company's actual business registration, which listed lawn care and irrigation as its only licensed services, correspondence showing Beckett's repeated dismissal of my written concerns. I wasn't building a case yet, not exactly. I was doing what 15 years of professional responsibility had trained me to do automatically, which was keep a clean, defensible record of exactly what I knew and when I knew it. If you've ever watched someone dismantle something you spent years building, convinced they understood it better after 4 months than you did after 15 years, hit like right now. I'd love to know in the comments if you've ever kept quiet records of exactly how badly things were going, long before anyone else was ready to admit it. 3 weeks before the scheduled investor presentation, the state's annual fire safety compliance documents came due, requiring my signature as the facility's licensed responsible engineer, certifying that all suppression systems had been maintained and inspected according to code by qualified contractors. Beckett called me into his office, the old operations suite that used to be mine, and told me, plainly, that he needed my signature on the documents by end of day, that the landscaping company's paperwork was close enough to compliant, and that any delay in filing risked pushing back the investor presentation he'd spent months building toward. I told him I couldn't sign it, because it wasn't true. He told me, with a specific irritation of someone who had genuinely never expected pushback, that my job was to sign what the company needed signed, and that if I couldn't handle that basic requirement, he'd find someone who could. I explained as calmly as I could manage that there wasn't anyone else who could, because I was the only person at that facility holding the license the state required for that exact signature, a fact he apparently hadn't bothered to confirm before threatening to replace me over it. I didn't sign the document. I drew a single line through the signature field instead, shredded my copy in front of him, and told him I'd be formally notifying the state fire marshal's office that I was withdrawing my operational oversight of the facility, effective immediately, a legal step available to any licensed responsible engineer who determines a facility is being operated outside of code. He laughed, initially, apparently assuming this was a negotiating tactic rather than the specific legal notice it actually was. I filed the withdrawal that same afternoon, along with the documentation I'd been keeping for months, the temperature logs, the landscaping company's actual registration, copies of my written warnings, and Beckett's dismissive replies. Under state code, a facility of that size and classification cannot legally continue operating without a licensed responsible engineer of record, a requirement that triggers an immediate compliance review once a withdrawal like mine is filed. The investor presentation was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I wasn't there when the fire marshal's inspection team arrived 40 minutes in, though I heard the details afterward from 2 former colleagues who called me, separately, within the hour. The inspectors found server room temperatures 9 degrees above code threshold, a fire suppression system serviced by an unlicensed contractor, and no responsible engineer of record on file as of that morning, 3 violations serious enough to trigger an immediate operational shutdown rather than a standard follow-up notice. The servers overheated within the hour of the building's power being restricted during the shutdown process, a cascading failure that took down service for most of the 40 companies relying on that facility, an outage that made regional business news by that evening. The investors, watching all of this unfold mid-presentation rather than in some hypothetical future scenario, withdrew their funding offer before the meeting even formally ended. I heard, secondhand, that Beckett tried calling the state fire marshal's office directly that afternoon, attempting to argue that my withdrawal had been retaliatory rather than legitimate, an argument that apparently didn't survive contact with the documentation I'd already filed alongside it. Randall Ashgrove came out of retirement within the week, working to salvage what remained of the company, and reached out to me personally, an honest, difficult conversation in which he acknowledged, plainly, that handing the facility to his son without checking whether Beckett understood what he was actually inheriting had been a mistake he was only now beginning to fully measure the cost of. I'd already accepted a position at a competing regional provider by then, a role with a proper office, a salary that reflected 15 years of expertise rather than 4 months of being told that expertise was obsolete, and a license that, as of that Tuesday afternoon, had never felt more clearly like mine to control. The original facility remained shut down for 6 weeks, while new leadership brought in a properly licensed engineer and paid, considerably more than they'd ever paid me, to bring the building back into compliance from scratch. I think about that janitorial closet sometimes, the specific, small indignity of being told my 15 years didn't justify the square footage I'd occupied since the building was built, the mop sink still visible from where I used to sit typing incident reports on a laptop balanced against my knees. I don't think about it with much anger anymore. I think about it mostly as the exact moment I stopped believing that staying quiet and doing the job well would eventually be enough to protect me, and started using the one thing they'd never actually managed to take away, a license with my name on it and nobody else's. If you've ever been asked to put your own name on something you knew was a lie, tell me about it in the comments. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and I'll see you in the next.